The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Windsor Castle, as Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood at the tall windows of her private study. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the official letter that had arrived just hours earlier. The words seemed to blur together as she read them for the third time, each reading making the reality more painful than the last. William had been called away on an urgent diplomatic mission that would take him to a region torn by conflict. The mission was classified dangerous and would separate them for an unknown period. As she folded the letter carefully, Catherine felt the weight of duty pressing down on her shoulders, like a heavy cloak she could never remove. The couple had always known that their roles would sometimes demand sacrifices that ordinary families never had to make. But knowing something in theory and living it in practice were entirely different experiences. Catherine walked slowly to their bedroom, where William was already packing his travel bag with the quiet efficiency of someone trained for such moments. Neither of them spoke at first. The silence between them was filled with all the words they wanted to say, but couldn't find the courage to voice. William folded his clothes with careful precision, each movement deliberate and controlled. Catherine watched him, memorizing every detail of this ordinary moment that felt anything but ordinary. Finally, William looked up and caught her eyes in the mirror. The reflection showed two people trying to be strong for each other, trying to hide the fear and uncertainty that threatened to overwhelm them. He turned around and walked to her, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. "The children don't know yet," Catherine whispered, her voice barely audible. "How do we tell them that Daddy has to go away and we don't know when he'll come back?" The question hung in the air between them like a bridge neither wanted to cross. William pulled her close, and for a moment, they were not the Prince and Princess of Wales. They were simply a husband and wife facing an impossible situation. Catherine breathed in his familiar scent, trying to store the memory for the lonely nights ahead. She could feel his heart beating against her cheek, strong and steady, just as it had been on their wedding day when they had promised to face whatever came their way together. The irony was not lost on either of them. They had spent years learning to live their lives in the public eye, to share their joys and sorrows with a nation that looked to them for stability and hope. But this moment, this goodbye, felt too private, too raw to be anything but their own. Outside their window, the world continued as normal. Gardeners tended to the perfectly manicured lawns, security personnel made their regular rounds, and staff members went about their daily duties. None of them knew that behind the ancient walls of the castle, two hearts were breaking with the knowledge of what lay ahead. Catherine stepped back and looked at William's face, trying to memorize every line, every expression. She had always been amazed by his strength, by the way he carried the weight of his future crown with such grace, but now she could see the vulnerability in his eyes, the uncertainty that he rarely allowed anyone to witness. "Promise me something," she said, her voice stronger now. "Promise me that you'll come back to us, not as the Prince of Wales, not as the future king, but as William, as the man who makes our children laugh and who knows exactly how I like my tea in the morning." William nodded, unable to trust his voice to remain steady. He knew that making such a promise was dangerous, that there were no guarantees in the mission he was about to undertake. But looking at Catherine, seeing the love and fear in her eyes, he knew that he would move heaven and earth to keep that promise. The morning light grew stronger, streaming through the windows and illuminating the room where their love story had grown and deepened over the years. Soon this same light would see him boarding a plane that would take him thousands of miles away from everything he held dear. The breakfast room at Kensington Palace had never felt more like a stage than it did that morning. Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis sat at their usual spots around the family table, chattering excitedly about their plans for the day. Charlotte was telling her brothers about a drawing she wanted to finish, while Louis was more interested in the jam on his toast than any conversation. Catherine sat across from William, both of them pushing food around their plates without really eating. They had agreed the night before that they would tell the children together, but now that the moment had arrived, neither knew how to begin. How do you explain to young children that their father has to leave for reasons they cannot understand, to go to places they cannot name? George, being the eldest at 10, was the first to notice something was wrong. He had inherited his father's intuitive nature and his mother's emotional intelligence. "Mummy," he said quietly, "why do you and Papa look sad?" Catherine felt her throat tighten. She exchanged a glance with William, who cleared his throat and set down his cup of tea. "Children," he began, his voice gentle but serious. "Papa has to go away for a while to help some people who need our country's assistance." Charlotte immediately looked up from her drawing, her crayon suspended in midair. "Like a work trip?" she asked innocently. "Will you bring us presents like last time?" The simplicity of her question nearly broke William's composure. "It's a bit different this time, sweetheart," he managed to say. "I might be away for longer than usual, and I won't be able to call every day like I normally do." Louis, who was only 5, didn't fully grasp the conversation, but sensed the change in atmosphere. He climbed down from his chair and walked over to his father, wrapping his small arms around William's leg. "Don't go, Papa," he said simply. "Stay and play with us." Catherine had to excuse herself from the table, the weight of her children's innocence too much to bear. She stood by the window looking out at the garden where just yesterday the family had played together, laughing and carefree. William gently explained to the children that sometimes grown-ups have to do difficult things, even when they don't want to because it's the right thing to do. George nodded solemnly, trying to be the brave eldest son, but Catherine could see the confusion and hurt in his young eyes. Charlotte began to cry quietly, and William lifted her onto his lap, holding her close while trying to comfort all 3 children at once. "Will you be safe, Papa?" George asked, the question that Catherine herself was too afraid to voice. William looked directly at his son, understanding that this moment would be remembered for years to come. "I will do everything I can to be safe and to come home to all of you," he said honestly. "And while I'm gone, I need you to take care of Mummy and your brother and sister. Can you do that for me?" George straightened his shoulders, accepting the responsibility his father was placing on him. "I will, Papa, I promise." The next few hours passed in a blur of forced normalcy. They played games, read stories, and tried to pretend that this was just another ordinary day. But underneath it all was the constant awareness that these were their last hours together for an indefinite period. Catherine found herself watching William with their children, memorizing the way he laughed at Louis's silly jokes, how he patiently helped Charlotte with her drawing, and how he spoke to George with the respect of one future king to another. These were the moments she would hold on to during the dark nights ahead. As evening approached, the reality of the impending departure became impossible to ignore. The children's bedtime routine took longer than usual, with extra stories and extended cuddles. Each child seemed to sense that this good night was different, more significant than all the others. Catherine stood in the doorway of Louis's room, watching William tuck their youngest son into bed. Louis had insisted on giving his father his favorite stuffed elephant, to keep Papa safe. William held the small toy carefully, as if it were made of the most precious material in the world. "I'll take very good care of Elliot," William promised. "And every time I look at him, I'll think of you and how much I love you." After the children were finally asleep, Catherine and William walked through their home together, each room holding memories of their life as a family. They paused at family photos, touched familiar objects, and shared quiet memories. The palace that had always been their sanctuary now felt like a museum of their happiness, each artifact a reminder of what William was leaving behind. The departure was scheduled for dawn, away from the public eye and media attention. In the pre-dawn darkness, Catherine stood beside the waiting car, her breath visible in the cold morning air. She had dressed carefully in a simple navy coat, wanting to look strong for William's last image of her, but her hands shook as she adjusted her scarf for the 3rd time. William's protection officers maintained a respectful distance, understanding the private nature of this moment. The only sounds were the soft idling of the engine and the distant calls of early morning birds. London was still asleep, unaware that one of their future kings was about to embark on a journey that would test everything he believed about duty and sacrifice. Catherine watched as William checked his briefcase one final time, his movements automatic and professional, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he gripped the handle just a little too tightly. She knew he was using his training to compartmentalize his emotions, to become the diplomat and representative his country needed him to be. "I keep thinking about our wedding day," Catherine said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Do you remember what you whispered to me at the altar?" William stopped his preparations and looked at her, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth despite the gravity of the moment. "I said that no matter what happened, "We would face it together," he replied softly. "And we will, even when we're apart. You'll be with me every step of the way." Catherine nodded, trying to hold on to his words like a lifeline. She had prepared herself for this moment, had practiced being strong, but now that it was here, she felt like a young woman again, scared and uncertain about the future. The weight of her royal duties seemed insignificant compared to the simple desire to keep her family together. They walked toward each other slowly, as if drawing out these final seconds could somehow stop time itself. When they embraced, Catherine felt William's arms tighten around her, and she knew he was struggling just as much as she was. They held each other in the growing light of dawn, two people trying to store up enough love to last through the uncertain weeks ahead. "Take care of yourself," Catherine whispered against his ear. "Not just your body, but your heart. Don't let this mission harden you or change who you are. The children and I need you to come back as the same man who leaves us this morning." William pulled back to look at her face, studying every feature as if he were seeing her for the first time. "You are the strongest person I know," he said. "Stronger than any king or queen who has come before us. I know you'll take care of everything while I'm gone, but please don't forget to take care of yourself too." The security detail approached carefully, indicating that it was time to leave. The schedule was tight and delays could compromise the security of the entire mission. William picked up his bag and walked toward the car, but stopped at the door and turned back to Catherine one more time. In that moment, standing in the driveway of their home, they were not public figures or representatives of the crown. They were simply a couple saying goodbye, hoping against hope that it would not be their last goodbye. Catherine raised her hand in a small wave, the gesture both intimate and formal, private yet somehow fitting for a princess watching her prince depart. As the car pulled away, Catherine remained standing in the same spot, watching until the taillights disappeared around the corner. The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in years, she was truly alone with her thoughts and fears. The magnificent palace around her felt empty and hollow without William's presence. She walked slowly back inside, her footsteps echoing in the quiet corridors. The children would wake soon, and she would need to be ready with answers to questions she wasn't sure how to handle. How do you explain to a child that their father might be gone for months? How do you maintain hope when you don't even know where he's going or what dangers he might face? Catherine made her way to her private study and sat at her desk, pulling out a sheet of her personal stationery. She began to write the first of what she hoped would be many letters to William, knowing that he might not receive them for weeks, if at all. But the act of writing to him made her feel connected, made the distance between them seem a little less vast. Outside her window, London was beginning to wake up. People were starting their normal routines, unaware that their future queen was sitting alone, missing her husband and trying to find the strength to carry on without him. Catherine looked at the clock and realized that in just a few hours, she would need to put on her public face and attend a charity event, smiling and engaging with people while her heart was thousands of miles away. 3 weeks had passed since William's departure, and Catherine had established a routine that helped her cope with his absence. She woke before the children each morning, spending quiet moments in her study reading whatever limited communications she could receive about the mission. The information was always vague, always filtered through official channels, never containing the personal details she desperately craved. The children had adapted in their own ways. George had become more serious, taking his role as the man of the house with touching solemnity. He helped his younger siblings with their homework and made sure they brushed their teeth without being reminded. Charlotte had become clingy, following Catherine from room to room and asking repeatedly when Papa would call. Louis, being the youngest, seemed to accept his father's absence with the resilience of childhood. Though he still asked for Papa's elephant at bedtime, Catherine's public appearances had continued as scheduled, but those close to her could see the strain. Her smile was a little too bright, her laughter a little too quick. She threw herself into her charitable work with increased intensity, as if staying busy could somehow fill the void William's absence had created. On this particular morning, Catherine was preparing for a visit to a children's hospital when her private secretary knocked on her study door. "Your Royal Highness," she said quietly, "there's been a development regarding the prince's mission. The foreign secretary is on his way to brief you." Catherine's blood ran cold. In 3 weeks, this was the first time anyone had requested an urgent meeting about William's situation. She tried to remain calm, but her mind immediately went to the worst possible scenarios. Had something happened to him? Was he injured? The next hour stretched endlessly as she waited for news. When the foreign secretary arrived, his expression was carefully neutral, giving nothing away. Catherine received him in the formal drawing room, sitting straight-backed in her chair, every inch the composed princess the public expected her to be. But inside, her heart was racing with fear and anticipation. "Your Royal Highness," he began carefully, "I want to assure you first that the prince is safe and well. However, the situation in the region has become more complex than initially anticipated. The mission timeline has been extended indefinitely." The words hit Catherine like a physical blow. Indefinitely. The words seemed to echo in the elegant room. Bouncing off the antique furniture and crystal chandeliers, she had prepared herself for a few weeks, maybe a month of separation, but indefinitely suggested something much longer, much more uncertain. "What does that mean exactly?" Catherine asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "Are we talking about months, a year?" The foreign secretary looked uncomfortable. "I'm afraid we simply don't know, Your Royal Highness. The prince's diplomatic skills have proven invaluable in the negotiations, and his presence is considered essential to the success of the peace process. We're looking at a minimum of several more months, possibly longer." Catherine nodded slowly, processing the information. She thought of the children's questions about when Papa would come home, questions she had been answering with hopeful estimates that now seemed painfully naive. She thought of the empty space in their bed, the quiet dinners, the family photos that seemed to mock her with their happiness. "Is there any way for more regular communication?" she asked. "The children miss him terribly, and even a brief call would mean everything to them." "I understand completely," the foreign secretary replied. "We're working on establishing more secure communication channels, but the security situation makes regular contact extremely difficult. The prince's safety depends on maintaining the strictest operational security." After the meeting ended and the foreign secretary left, Catherine sat alone in the drawing room for a long time. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air like tiny spirits. She thought about all the royal couples throughout history, who had faced similar separations, who had sacrificed their personal happiness for the greater good of the nation. But knowing that others had endured similar trials didn't make her own pain any less real. She missed William's laugh, the way he made silly faces at the breakfast table to make the children giggle. She missed their late-night conversations about everything and nothing, the comfortable silence they shared while reading together in the evening. That night, Catherine sat at her desk again, writing another letter to William. She told him about George's latest school project, about Charlotte's newfound interest in piano lessons, about Louis's obsession with a new toy airplane. She wrote about the small daily moments that made up their family life, hoping that somehow these ordinary details would reach him across the distance and remind him of what was waiting for him at home. As she sealed the letter, Catherine made a decision. Tomorrow, she would call the children together and explain the new situation honestly but gently. They deserved to know the truth, and she needed to prepare them for a longer separation than any of them had anticipated. Somehow they would get through this together, even while they were apart. 2 months into William's absence, Catherine received an unexpected call that would change everything. She was reviewing her schedule for the following week when her private secretary rushed into the room, her face flushed with excitement and concern. "Your Royal Highness," she said breathlessly, "we've just received word that the prince will be able to make a secure video call in approximately 1 hour. It's the first direct communication we've been able to arrange since his departure." Catherine felt her heart leap into her throat. 2 months of wondering, worrying, and missing him had led to this moment. She immediately thought of the children, who were at their various lessons. George was at school, Charlotte was having her piano lesson in the music room, and Louis was napping after lunch. "Can we gather the children in time?" Catherine asked, already moving toward the door. "I know Charlotte's lesson isn't supposed to end for another 30 minutes, but surely we can make an exception." Within minutes, the household was in gentle chaos as staff members quietly but efficiently gathered the children. Charlotte was confused about why her piano lesson was being cut short, but her confusion turned to joy when she learned the reason. George came running from school, still in his uniform, his face bright with anticipation. Louis woke from his nap cranky and disoriented, but the promise of seeing Papa through the computer screen quickly changed his mood. Catherine found herself unexpectedly nervous as they set up the secure video connection in William's study. She had imagined this moment countless times, but now that it was here, she worried about everything. Would he look different? Would the strain of the mission show on his face? How would the children react to seeing their father on a screen, instead of being able to hug him? When the connection finally established and William's face appeared on the screen, Catherine felt tears spring to her eyes immediately. He looked tired, thinner than when he had left. But his smile was the same warm, genuine expression that had made her fall in love with him years ago. Behind him, she could see what appeared to be a simple room with plain walls, giving no clues about his location. "Hello, my darlings," William said, his voice slightly delayed by the connection but unmistakably his. "I've missed you all so much." Louis was the first to react, pressing his small hands against the computer screen as if he could somehow touch his father through the glass. "Papa," he exclaimed, "why are you in the computer? Can you come out?" Catherine had to laugh despite her tears. Charlotte climbed onto the chair next to her mother, staring at the screen with wide eyes. "Papa, you look different," she said with the honest observation of a child. "Are you eating enough vegetables?" George stood slightly behind his siblings, trying to maintain the mature composure he had adopted in his father's absence. But Catherine could see the emotion in his young face, the relief and joy at seeing his father safe and well. "I'm eating plenty of vegetables, sweetheart," William assured Charlotte, "though they're not as good as the ones Mummy makes sure you eat at home." His eyes found Catherine's through the camera, and she saw all the love and longing he couldn't express in front of the children. For the next 30 precious minutes, they talked about everything and nothing. William asked about school, about friends, about the new tricks their dog had learned. The children showed him drawings they had made, toys they had received, and Louis performed an impromptu dance that made William laugh so hard that the sound filled the room with warmth. But underneath the joy of the reunion was the constant awareness that this was temporary, that in a few minutes the screen would go dark and they would be separated again. Catherine watched William's face carefully, trying to read the emotions he was keeping carefully controlled for the children's sake. "When are you coming home, Papa?" Charlotte asked the question they were all thinking. "I made you a special drawing and I want to give it to you in person." William's expression grew serious for a moment. "I'm working very hard to come home as soon as I can, sweetheart. But the work I'm doing here is very important, and it might take a little longer than we hoped. But I promise you I think about coming home to all of you every single day." As the call neared its end, each child said their individual goodbyes. George shook hands with the camera formally, making William smile. Charlotte blew kisses and promised to practice piano extra hard. Louis simply pressed his face against the screen and said, "Love you, Papa," over and over until Catherine gently pulled him back. When it was just Catherine and William on the call, the playful atmosphere shifted to something more intimate and raw. "How are you really?" she asked quietly. "And I want the truth, not the diplomatic answer." William's careful composure cracked slightly. "I miss you all terribly," he admitted. "There are moments when I wonder if I'm doing the right thing, being here instead of home with my family. But Catherine, the work we're doing here, if we succeed, it could prevent a conflict that would affect millions of people." Catherine nodded, understanding the weight of his words. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. "The children and I are managing, and will continue to manage for as long as necessary. Just promise me you're taking care of yourself too." When the call ended and the screen went dark, the study felt emptier than ever. But something had changed. The children had seen their father, heard his voice, been reminded that he was real and safe and thinking of them. And Catherine had seen in his eyes the same love and determination that had carried them through every challenge they had faced together. 4 months after William's departure, Catherine stood at the window of her study watching the first snow of winter fall across the palace grounds. The trees that had been green when William left were now bare, their branches reaching toward a gray sky like arms stretched in supplication. The changing seasons marked the passage of time in a way that felt both gradual and sudden. The children had grown during these months in ways that went beyond their physical development. George had become her confidant and helper, sensing when she was struggling and offering small gestures of support. Just that morning, He had brought her tea without being asked, prepared exactly the way she liked it. Charlotte had channeled her missing her father into her artwork, creating dozens of pictures that she carefully stored in a special box for when Papa comes home. Louis had developed an imaginary game where he talked to Papa through various household objects, having full conversations with telephones, mirrors, and even the toaster. Catherine herself had discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. The public engagements continued, the charitable work expanded, and she had taken on additional responsibilities to cover for William's absence. But the most challenging part wasn't the increased workload. It was maintaining hope and optimism for the children while dealing with her own fears and uncertainties. The irregular communications from William had become both a blessing and a burden. Each brief message or rare phone call was precious, but they also highlighted how much they didn't know about his situation. The diplomatic language of the official updates told her nothing about whether he was sleeping well, whether he was lonely, whether he was losing hope of coming home. On this snowy afternoon, Catherine was reviewing plans for the Christmas celebrations when her private secretary entered with an expression she had learned to recognize, the careful neutrality that preceded important news about William's mission. "Your Royal Highness," she began slowly, "we've received an update from the Foreign Office. There's been a significant breakthrough in the peace negotiations. The Prince's role has been instrumental in reaching a preliminary agreement between the conflicting parties." Catherine felt her pulse quicken. "What does this mean for his return?" she asked, hardly daring to hope. "The preliminary agreement needs to be ratified by the respective governments, which could take several weeks. However, if the ratification is successful, the Prince's mission could be concluded by early spring." Early spring. Catherine looked at the calendar on her desk, calculating the weeks and months. It would still be another 3 months at minimum. But for the first time since William had left, there was a concrete timeline, a light at the end of the tunnel that seemed real rather than wishful thinking. That evening, Catherine gathered the children in the sitting room where they often spent their evenings together. The fireplace was crackling, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and outside the snow continued to fall steadily. She had decided to share the hopeful news with them, but she wanted to be careful not to raise expectations too high in case something went wrong. "I have some news about Papa," she began, watching their faces light up with attention. "The important work he's been doing is going very well, and there's a chance he might be able to come home in the spring." Charlotte immediately began bouncing in her chair. "Spring, like when the flowers come back? When is that? How many sleeps?" George, ever practical, asked more serious questions. "Is he safe? Will the work definitely be finished then?" Catherine explained as much as she could in terms they would understand, emphasizing that these were hopeful signs, but that they needed to remain patient. Louis, who had been quietly playing with his toy cars during the conversation, suddenly looked up and asked, "Will Papa remember how to play with us when he comes back?" The innocent question caught Catherine off guard. She realized that for Louis, 4 months represented a significant portion of his young life. He had genuine concerns about whether his father would still be the same person who had left them on that cold morning, so many months ago. "Papa will always remember how to play with you," Catherine assured him, pulling him onto her lap. "He loves you all so much, and that love doesn't change no matter how far away he is or how long he's been gone." That night, after the children were asleep, Catherine sat at her desk and began writing what she hoped might be one of her last letters to William as a separated wife. She told him about the snow, about the children's reactions to the news, about how the palace felt different with the promise of his return hanging in the air like morning mist. She also wrote about her fears, that he might have changed during his time away, that the intensity of his diplomatic mission might have hardened him, that the easy intimacy of their marriage might need time to rebuild. But mostly, she wrote about her love for him and her pride in what he was accomplishing, even at such personal cost to their family. As she sealed the letter, Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced in months: genuine hope. Not the forced optimism she had maintained for the children's sake, but real, solid hope based on concrete progress. The separation that had seemed endless now had a visible endpoint, and she could begin to imagine the day when William would walk through their door and their family would be complete again. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in a clean, white blanket that made everything look new and full of possibility. The call came on a bright March morning when the first daffodils were pushing through the soil in the palace gardens. Catherine was having breakfast with the children when her private secretary appeared in the doorway with tears in her eyes and a smile on her face. "Your Royal Highness," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "The Foreign Secretary is on the line with news about the prince's return." Catherine's hands shook as she took the phone. After 6 months of uncertainty, 6 months of missed bedtime stories and empty chairs at the dinner table, she was almost afraid to hope that this was the call she had been waiting for. "Your Royal Highness?" The Foreign Secretary's voice was warm with satisfaction. "I'm delighted to inform you that the peace agreement has been successfully ratified by all parties. The prince's mission is complete, and he will be returning home tomorrow evening." Tomorrow evening. The words seemed to echo in Catherine's mind as she tried to process what she was hearing. After months of indefinite waiting, the end had come with startling suddenness. Tomorrow evening, William would be home. The children, who had been watching their mother's face carefully during the phone call, began to understand that something momentous was happening. Charlotte was the first to ask, "Is Papa coming home?" And when Catherine nodded, unable to speak through her tears, the breakfast room erupted into chaos. George let out a whoop of joy that was completely unlike his usual controlled demeanor. Charlotte began dancing around the table singing, "Papa's coming home," at the top of her lungs. Louis, not entirely understanding what was happening but caught up in the excitement, joined in the celebration with his own version of a happy dance. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Catherine found herself cleaning rooms that were already spotless, arranging flowers that didn't need arranging, and checking the time every few minutes as if that would somehow make William's plane arrive faster. The children were equally restless. Charlotte insisted on wearing her best dress for Papa's homecoming, even though he wouldn't arrive until after her bedtime. George helped the staff prepare William's study, carefully arranging his papers and books exactly as they had been before he left. Louis carried his stuffed elephant around with him constantly, explaining to anyone who would listen that he was going to return it to Papa. As evening approached, Catherine stood before her mirror, preparing for William's arrival with the same nervous excitement she had felt on their wedding day. She had chosen a simple blue dress, William's favorite color, and the sapphire earrings he had given her for their anniversary. But as she looked at her reflection, she realized that she looked different than she had 6 months ago. The separation had changed her, had given her a new understanding of her own strength and resilience. The car carrying William arrived just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Catherine waited in the entrance hall with the children, who were practically vibrating with excitement, despite their exhaustion from the emotional day. When the door opened and William stepped inside, the first thing Catherine noticed was how much thinner he looked, how the lines around his eyes had deepened. But when he smiled, that same warm, genuine smile that had sustained her through the darkest moments of their separation, she knew that the man she loved had come home unchanged in all the ways that mattered. The children rushed toward him as one, and William dropped to his knees to gather them all in his arms. Catherine watched through tears as he kissed each of their heads, as he listened to their excited chatter about everything he had missed, as he assured them again and again that he was really, truly home. When the children finally released him and William stood to face Catherine, the months of separation seemed to collapse into a single moment of recognition and reunion. They moved toward each other slowly, as if they were afraid that sudden movements might break the spell and reveal this to be just another dream. When William finally reached Catherine, he cupped her face in his hands, studying every detail as if he were seeing her for the first time. "You're even more beautiful than I remembered," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. Catherine laughed through her tears. "You're a terrible liar," she replied. "But I've missed your terrible lies almost as much as I've missed everything else about you." Their embrace was different from the desperate goodbye they had shared 6 months earlier. This was not the clinging embrace of people afraid of separation, but the confident reunion of two people who had weathered the storm and found their way back to each other. Catherine felt the last of her fears dissolve as she realized that William was indeed the same man who had left, tired, marked by his experiences, but fundamentally unchanged in his love for his family. The evening that followed was both ordinary and magical. They had dinner together as a family for the first time in 6 months, with William laughing at the children's stories and marveling at how much they had grown. Charlotte presented him with the box of drawings she had been saving, watching his face carefully as he examined each one. George showed him the responsibility chart he had created to help manage household tasks in his father's absence. Louis, true to his word, solemnly returned the stuffed elephant, though William immediately gave it back, explaining that Elliot had done such a good job protecting Papa that he deserved to stay with Louis after the children were finally settled in bed, process that took much longer than usual as none of them wanted to let William out of their sight. Catherine and William found themselves alone together for the first time since his return. They sat in their private sitting room, the fire crackling softly, finally able to simply be present with each other without the pressure of public duties or children's needs. "Tell me about the hardest day," Catherine said quietly, "the day when you weren't sure you could continue." William was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "It was about 3 months in," he finally said. "We had reached what seemed like an impossible impasse in the negotiations. People were talking about abandoning the peace process entirely. I sat in my room that night thinking about how I might have been away from all of you for nothing, how the sacrifice might have been pointless." Catherine took his hand, feeling the calluses that hadn't been there before he left. "What changed your mind?" "I remembered something you said on our wedding day," William replied, turning to look at her. "You said that the hardest things we do are often the most worthwhile, and that true love isn't just about being together in the easy moments. It's about supporting each other through the difficult ones, even when we're apart." Catherine felt fresh tears spring to her eyes. She had said those words so many years ago, never imagining that they would be tested in such a profound way. Did it help? Did remembering that make the separation easier? William shook his head. It didn't make it easier. Nothing could have made it easier. But it reminded me that what we were doing, what you were doing at home with the children, what I was doing in those negotiations, it was all part of the same thing. We were both serving something larger than ourselves, and we were doing it together even when we were apart. As the fire burned lower and the palace settled into nighttime quiet around them, Catherine and William talked about everything and nothing, reconnecting not just as husband and wife, but as partners who had weathered their greatest test and emerged stronger. The 6 months of separation had been the hardest thing either of them had ever endured, but it had also proven the unshakable foundation of their love and commitment. Outside their window, the spring flowers that had begun to bloom during William's absence continued their patient growth, preparing to burst into full flower just as their family was blooming again into completeness. The farewell that had moved a nation with its quiet dignity had been matched by a reunion that proved that some bonds are strong enough to span any distance, survive any test, and emerge not just intact but deeper than before. That night, as Catherine fell asleep beside William for the first time in 6 months, she understood that they had not simply survived his absence, they had been transformed by it. The easy happiness of their early marriage had been replaced by something more profound, the hard-won knowledge that their love could endure anything, that their family could weather any storm, and that the duty they owed to their nation would never be stronger than the duty they owed to each other.